one of the ones I like is people who talk about augmented intelligence, because for me, that's a better description. This idea of artificial, almost synthetic, right? It's not like it created its own version of intelligence. AI systems fundamentally learn from humanity's knowledge, from humanity's toil and labor and products and content and art and all of that, and then try to pay it back by augmenting what we already know how to do by helping us to either do it, faster, cheaper, bigger, better. I would agree with you. The artificial nature of it doesn't really speak to, what it really does, or to some extent, even what it really is.
How are you augmenting your intelligence to build a more sustainable brand? Artificially or artfully? If you're bringing your own expertise, your lived experience, and your strategic judgment to AI as a true collaborator, then you're turning one of the greatest technological forces of our time into a genuine competitive advantage. But most people are just prompting and hoping, getting back generic slop that sounds like everybody else, and you know what? It can destroy your reputation. Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell. My buddy Bruno Sarda is here today. He's Ernst & Young's America's Climate Change and Sustainability Services leader, named one of the most influential sustainability voices in the country, a top 50 environmental leader, and a top 10 global sustainability influencer. Bruno hosts the Sustainability Matters podcast and is a professor of practice at Arizona State University's College of Global Futures. You'll discover why deregulation is strengthening the business case for sustainability, how AI is both a superpower and a threat for ESG, and why we all have the magic now, as long as you know how to cast the spell. Hey, Bruno, welcome back to the Business of Story.
Hey, Park, good to see you.
Yeah, you and I go, gosh, way back when in the sustainability world, when you were working in sustainable supply chains for a high-tech company, and everybody knows, a very large one. And then you were kind enough to invite me into your world at Arizona State University, and we shared some teaching professorial work together and in sustainability there for 5 years, one of the greatest experiences of my life. And then you have gone on to a number of different things. I'll let you kind of recount your overall story, but you are here today, heading up sustainability services in the Americas for Ernst & Young. And we're going to really explore this idea about what are you seeing in AI, sustainable storytelling? Where are people giving you the pushback? And, where are you seeing that it's going to go? So with all that, Bruno, welcome again. And why don't you give our listeners just a little bit of background on you and how you find yourself and where you are today?
Sure. Well, again, thanks again for having me, Park. It's been great to watch, all the stories you've helped, tell through this remarkable podcast. So, congrats to you on such an amazing platform. My story is. In itself, I tell it often. Many of my students want to know, how I got to where I was, and it's easier to try to draw that narrative looking backwards. I'm always very honest to say, it's not like I designed it that way, but I would say I've had two main chapters to my career. I spent the first, let's say, half or so in the world of, what we now call digital transformation. Back then, we called it e-business. It was about a decade in financial services, and then spent, as you said, about a decade in tech. And I pivoted into sustainability about halfway into that career. But really from the mid-90s, trying to help within an organizational pathway absorb the massively disruptive force that was the internet. Of course, today we take the internet as this thing for granted that we can't possibly live without. But back then, when it started rolling out of university labs into corporate processes, into kind of customer experiences for this first websites and online experiences, it was massively disruptive. it was very threatening to many organizations about how it would change the nature of their customer relationships, of their cost structures, of their competitive advantage. The old location was very threatened by the fact that you could create virtual experiences, virtual call centers, virtual everything. Um, and so, I think what I learned through that first 15 or so years in my career was this idea of, you know, how do you take disruptive, transformative innovations like the internet and later, wireless technologies and those kinds of things and turn them to your advantage? Um, and my pivot into sustainability was a little bit based on that sustainability in many ways is kind of like the internet, as it's a disruptive force for change that kind of is plowing its way through society. And just like the internet really didn't leave anything unchanged in our society, and the way we work and the way we communicate and the way we whatever shop, you name it. Even now, I've read, I think, over 90% of people who meet now meet through dating apps and those kinds of things. Like literally how we even evolve as a species seems like it's been very digitally enabled. And sustainability is a lot like that. Sustainability is in its own doesn't have its own set of goals, but rather it's about trying to help society transform in a way that creates more sustainable, more durable, more equitable pathways to achieve the things we already want to achieve, right? Prosperity and economic success and security and all of these things.
Yeah, when we started working together in sustainability, you had the best definition to it. And when I saw you a couple weeks ago, I said, "Are you still using that?" And you said, "Yes, I am." And I love it because I actually used it on my show last week in talking with a gentleman who's got a sustainable furniture company. And it first came up in me because I would always see, when I was running my ad agency, Park & Co., we were doing a lot of conservation campaigns, water conservation, water use it wisely, and so forth. And I would see people flinch, business people flinch at the term sustainability, back then green marketing and whatever, because they always felt like it was a cost. Oh my God, what are you going to make me do without? Or what's that going to cost me to implement? Until I met you, you said, really, Park, all sustainability is it use it to grow your business, reduce risk, and amplify your brand, strengthen your brand. And I just thought that was one of the best descriptions I've ever heard of it.
Well, uh, early in my sustainability days, somebody uh, told me that really the role of the chief sustainability officer is to be a chief translation officer. And because of course some people care a lot about sustainability for what it is, for what it means, but most don't. And not because they don't care, it's just because it lacks context and meaning for them. And this idea of how to make it contextual, how to make it real. And somebody once joked with me, it's like, well, sustainable isn't necessarily a great aspiration, right? If you say, hey, how are your kids doing? Oh, they're sustainable. It's like, well, what does that mean? So, this idea of in business, why sustainability matters to business, this idea that at the end of the day, it helps businesses achieve what businesses want to achieve, which is, you know, grow the top line, reduce the risk and protect the bottom line, and then kind of enhance your brand as a product, as an employer, as a competitor, as a market participant. And sustainability helps you do all those things. And so once you frame it in the context of something the organization's trying to achieve, it makes it a lot easier because then the sustainability becomes the how and not the what.
Yeah. Let's talk about your evolution a little bit more. Like you said, you were in the tech world and then evolved into the sustainability world. You got your master's in, remind me of that program you took because I thought it was so cool.
Master of Applied Ethics in Science and Technology.
Yeah, which is a natural evolution, whether it was prescient or not at the time, into AI. And we're going to talk about that in a minute because that, of course, is one of our biggest disruptive forces happening right now. But before that, you have really evolved into your own storytelling storytelling position, and you've got this great podcast, what sustainability matters. When did you feel like your own innate storyteller started coming out and having the impact in the story in the sustainability world you were hoping for?
Well, I did not create that podcast. Actually, a former colleague of mine at EY had started it, and when she left the firm, wanted to make sure it'd be in good hands, and so I was fortunate to have the opportunity to take it over, and it's for sure something that you'll know even better than I do, Park, is that there is so much human emotion that exists at the heart of the work we do in sustainability. And the opportunity to get sustainability practitioners, leaders, or other experts really bring their story to life, and not only what they're doing and maybe what you could read in a report, but it's like, how did that go? What did it take? Who came along with your journey? Who were your champions, your heroes? Your what barriers did you face? And just really kind of unpacking the story of how you get that work done. Because we find in the sustainability practitioner professional community that there is so much community in practice, and so much generosity in sharing what worked, what was done, a lot of pre-competitive, even collaboration, companies that, wouldn't want to find themselves collaborating on anything, collaborate on sustainability. So it has a, um, a tremendous kind of connective power, and stories and discussions like what you can do on a podcast like this to go, get off the page a little bit and ask those how questions, and get a little bit more of that kind of human emotion, and that tension that often exists in the system, trying to solve for multiple things that aren't always exactly congruent or aligned, and really just unpacking the how did you get stuff done and what did that take, is such a powerful, I think, reinforcement of both the ingenuity, the perseverance, the creativity, and ultimately, I think the grit that so many people in sustainability have.
All right, from one host now to another, Bruno. Hosting your show, what was one of your own personal big ahas that you learned about, I don't know, human interaction, storytelling? It's different when you're on a show like this and you're hosting a show, but for you, what was one of the big moments that you understood or were, learned by?
Sure. I mean, as you know, we love all our children, and all the episodes we did had their own magic and their own brilliance. But one stands out for me, partly because, to your point, I feel like I learned so much, and it kind of triggered some unlocks in my own brain. It was actually with the chief sustainability officer of the world's largest cement manufacturer. Now, you'd think it's pretty hard to get excited about cement. Uh, but cement is this tremendous thing that most people don't really think about all day. But to give you a sense, cement, the carbon emissions associated with the production of cement are about twice that of air travel
Hmm.
globally. So, about 3.5% of global emissions accrue to air travel, commercial and private. Um, and cement manufacturing is about 7% of global
Wow.
emissions.
I wonder if
And
the
this,
Romans knew that way back when.
and this company having the largest market share in the world, about 15% of that market meant that about 1% of global emissions um, were tied with that particular company. Now, we talk a lot about, big tech companies, big, data centers, et cetera. That would probably be 1/100th of what we're talking about here. So I think what was fascinating to me, one was I think the responsibility, and I think the accountability that that organization felt for that they understood both the critical importance of what they do to the global economy. Again, like if cement manufacturing stops, a lot of things stop, right? And so being, very diligent in how they run their business. It's a relatively low margin business, so you have to be really wise in how you invest capital. And yet, the incredible ingenuity and innovation and collaboration that went into achieving very significant results in dramatically reducing the carbon intensity of cement, and all along the way, kind of in the various partnerships and collaborations. And again, you think sometimes of innovation, you think of pharma or tech or a new textile, and some of these more centuries old industrial kind of very blue collar kind of things aren't always given credit for how ingenious and creative, and the creative problem solving that goes into running those businesses to make them last for centuries more, was illuminating for me.
And you did a recent show, if I have the title right here, Can AI Help Reverse Nature Loss, or Does It Risk Accelerating It? And that just came to mind because you were talking, comparing the large tech companies and their plants out there compared to the cement industry. What do you think about that with the advent of AI? Is it going to help or hurt?
You know, I mentioned earlier, the internet as this massively disruptive force for change and technology. And we look back at it today, and of course, very few people say, oh, we should have never done this, right? And yet at the time, we were having a lot of the same conversations, that the internet was going to, unravel the fabric of society. It was going to do a lot of things. And of course, a lot of the things that we wish were different in society today could, be tied back to the ubiquitous nature of online platforms. A lot of people have opinions about whether things like social networks or dating apps or whatever have helped or hurt. And I think that the honest answer is they've done both. It's like any sort of force multiplier, right? It's going to amplify the good and it's going to amplify the bad. And I think AI is yet another very powerful and very disruptive and transformative example of that. But looking back through history, whether it was the invention of the steam engine, or again, or air travel, or so many other things that we've managed to introduce along the way. And so AI, when we ask that question somewhat provocatively, right, about nature, I think it's to make that tension visible, that it's not one or the other, is that it absolutely has the potential to dramatically unlock innovation at scale. Whether it's how we monitor nature laws, how we prevent nature laws, how we track keystone species. So many things that are very hard to do without the kind of um, computing power and sensing capability. Because we've had computing power for a long time, but the way AI can now take that massive computing power and actually collect a lot of information and interpret that information in ways that were impossible before. So I think it has absolutely the power to make tremendous strides in how we not only scale, but frankly, I think accelerate some of our sustainability efforts. And as a force multiplier, it can also lead to accelerated, nature and biodiversity loss, because it's going to help, maybe the industries that have had, this kind of tense relationship with nature, and especially in extractives or in the food supply chains, to do what they do bigger and faster as well. Or of course, the environmental footprint of the current AI ecosystems themselves, in terms of energy, in terms of water, in terms of land, and so on. So I think it's an and, not an or. But
Mhm.
you think our job is to make sure that in the end we look back and say it helped more than it didn't.
So let's level set with that. When you said our job, what is the job that you all are doing there at EY with climate change and sustainability services? Just so our listeners know, the kinds of companies you work with and what you are trying to help them with.
Sure. Um, well, we're very fortunate. The organization I run inside of EY is exactly that. It is inside of EY. We are inside, a very large, very kind of ubiquitous organization that has a tremendous brand and reach in financial accounting and auditing and tax accounting and in strategy and transactions and all kinds of different advisory and consulting services. So we get to be part of that, which is in itself tremendous. We work, by the virtue of who we are, we tend to work with the world's largest organizations. Um, some we audit, many we advise. And so our job in the climate and sustainability team, is we have, five key, if you will, dimensions with which we help organizations. We do, let's call it broad sustainability advisory strategy, goal setting, business case development, ROI strategy. So really kind of where does this fit in the business? And then we have more, I would say, maybe technical offerings, a whole kind of climate advisory set of services, anything from decarbonization strategies to greenhouse gas accounting to climate risk assessment and modeling, or climate transition plans, which are now required in some countries. Um, do the same for nature. Do also, of course, a lot of work in kind of reporting and regulatory readiness, working closely with both our financial accounting colleagues and the finance teams of our clients. We have a whole practice actually around environmental health and safety. And, again, going back to my cement example, EHS is, some people say, the ancestor of sustainability because it grew a lot out of there. But the idea of doing, environmental compliance, environmental remediation, certainly, environmental awareness in understanding impacts and opportunities, as well, of course, the health and safety, and we never take that for granted. Actually, something that shocked me a couple of years ago, I think it was 2024, in the U.S., had more workplace fatalities than in the previous 40 plus years.
Hmm.
So,
Wow.
we assume that things like, getting severely hurt or even potentially, um, fatal accidents on the job were things we heard in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. The fact is, many organizations, many industries today still have, very, very, sensitive, dangerous operations, and then it's really important to have very clear definitions around safety protocols, safety procedures, safety systems, and controls, and uh, so. So that's what we do, and then AI, of course, then becomes an enabler for all of that. So whether it's in the collection and reporting of data or the analysis of large complex data sets to try to understand how to prioritize action, how to track progress, combined with sometimes what is called physical AI, right? So physical systems, whether it's robotics, whether it's sensors, how to uh, uh, both enhance the operations and potentially limit the human exposure to dangerous processes or materials or chemicals, for example. So there's lots of applications and no no shortage of opportunity to continue doing that for across sectors. We literally work in every sector of the economy.
Well, you know me, Bruno. I come from the brand storytelling world, and I was actually coming back from a nuclear power plant in Texas about a month ago, working with the South Texas Project down there in their leadership and storytelling. And I had about 3 hours on the road driving across flat Texas, and it occurred to me that Artificial intelligence is about the worst brand name you could ever come up with one of the greatest technology advancements of our lifetime, certainly, right? And so, what does it produce? And what a lot of people are afraid of, it produces slop and it hallucinates and it gives you generalized stuff that sounds like everybody else. It truly is artificial intelligence. And I would like to reframe it and like to hear how you reframe it as artful intelligence. Because when a human, in my belief, and I've seen it with some of the work we've done in AI, when they really thoughtfully bring their expertise, their business acumen, their consumer insights, their marketing trending to AI and collaborate with it versus just leaning, all in on it, that it truly can turn it from being artificial intelligence to truly artful intelligence.
Oh, I love that. That's you should you should brand that somewhere if you haven't already. No, I agree, and I think it um, it 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 doesn't do itself justice to just call itself artificial intelligence. Partly because I think some of the most exciting things about AI are less about the intelligence part and what's done with it. So, for example, agentic AI, so AAI, which is also a relatively poor brand, uh, but this idea that you can train these things to act, not just to think, is I think has a tremendous potential. I've seen one of the ones I like is people who talk about augmented intelligence because for me that's a better description. This idea of artificial, almost synthetic, right? It's not like it created its own version of intelligence. AI systems fundamentally learn from humanity's knowledge, from humanity's toil and labor and products and content and art and all of that, and then try to paid back by augmenting what we already know how to do by helping us to either do it, faster, cheaper, bigger, better. And so for me, it's really more of a it's accretive, it's augmentative, and I would agree with you. The artificial nature of it doesn't really speak to what it really does, or to some extent even what it really is.
Yeah. Are you seeing customers or colleagues or people kind of still reluctant to embrace AI around sustainability? And how do you help lead them or get them over some of those, emotional hurdles, if you will, or intellectual gaps of like, no, man, I don't trust it. I don't want to have any part of it.
I mean, there's lots of discussions that we have with clients and colleagues. We at EY certainly have started embracing it really fully because again, we think it truly is a great augmentation of our skills and capabilities and talent. And we are a very tech forward organization and believe that that's the right thing for us to do, both in service of our own work and in service of our clients' work. A lot of the questions around AI as it gets close to sustainability, relate to a few domains, right? One, there's the one that comes up a lot around the environmental footprint, and it's like, yeah, it's great, but is it worth it based on the energy intensity, and in many parts because the energy intensity comes from very large data centers that consume a lot of power, and these data centers run very hot. And so then you need a lot of water to cool those data centers. It's not the only way that data centers get cooled, but for many, that's how they, just like in the cooling systems of power plants, you run a lot of water through to absorb the heat. Um, and so, we get lots of questions about the environmental impact, the environmental footprint, um, which I believe is a very manageable problem, like everything else. First, data centers have a decent amount of um, flexibility as to where they're going to get sited, and you see many of them try to get sited in places where they can have access to relatively low carbon energy. And so, if you can create abundant amounts of clean and affordable energy, then the energy footprint becomes a lot less of a problem right away. Um, the water intensity can be a little bit more problematic, but again, there's lots of innovations already about air cooling, about putting again where you can use a lot of water where it's not a problem. Like if you put something next to the Great Lakes or something, and you're pulling a lot of water out of those lakes. And by the way, that water goes right back in, right? It's again that the data centers don't drink the water; they 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 use it to flow through pipes to absorb heat and put it back a little bit warmer than they found it. Um, and then, there's that whole domain about the both the responsible use of AI and then more broadly the social impact of AI. Um, and lots of questions about what is it going to do to uh, to society, whether it's in leveraging this technology, for example, to accelerate the spread of false or misleading information. We look at these things I call these deep fake type videos now that are so hard to
Yeah.
tell to the untrained eye. Like, is this real? Is this not? I think it can create, mistrust in any information if we don't know, well, is this real? Is this not? Um, and for sure, these a lot of these questions about could AI, displace workers? And I think, the honest answer is it will, and it has, just like every other tech innovation before it. The internet, same. Lots of entire professions were kind of displaced. From I remember there were as many travel agents usually as there are now coffee shops around many street corners because that's how you booked your travel is you would use a travel agent. Um, one speaker I heard a couple of years ago said, every elevator used to have a job in it. Actually, he would use a slide that for these big high rises, every elevator used to have an elevator operator until somebody figured out, hey, you can just put buttons in there and the elevator will know where to stop. I think he was using that example that we grew up seeing that every taxi had a job in it, and there's probably a future where taxis maybe don't have a job in it because the taxi, just like we're seeing now with some of these autonomous vehicles already in some of the markets, that they're actually pretty good at getting around um, without having somebody behind the wheel. So we've seen that with every tech innovation, especially very significant tech innovation, has
Mm.
created entire new industries and ecosystems, and has displaced others. And it's very early in the days of AI where it still feels like we look at AI the thing, just like back earlier in my career, we looked at the internet the thing. But when you look at what the internet enabled in our economy, and you see some of the largest companies in the world now could not exist without that underlying technology. And they created entire platforms, ecosystems, and value added services and products on top of a technology they didn't build. Um, and I think it's going to be the same for AI. It's gonna usher in a new era of creation and innovation, and it's going to have for sure a disruptive effect. So that those are all the conversations we work on with our clients. Depending on where they are in their own level of tech adoption, where they're seeing both opportunity and risk to their business. I work, for example, personally pretty closely with the film and TV and music industries, and we know the history that they, as an industry, were relatively reluctant to embrace the digitization of their intellectual property. And so, in many ways, when you look at the largest media and streaming companies today, they're not necessarily the incumbents of 20 or 30 years ago. They're entirely new brands that embraced that technology to create new kinds of experiences that consumers embraced. And I think we're going to see more of that. We're going to see those who very focus on how do I protect my place in the market, my moat, as is sometimes called, and others who will innovate around that, and one day potentially be bigger than the behemoth competitors that they're going up against.
Well, Bruno, you've become one of the most recognized sustainability voices, storytellers, if you will, in the world. Certainly in the Americas. And you know that old saw you probably heard me tell our students many times. A story is only as good as your villain is bad, right? So right now, you all over at EY, yourself, and the clients that you are consulting with, you are dealing with an administration, obviously, that is kind of throwing sustainability out the window. My question to you is: does that make your job more daunting or more exciting?
I have to say it's made it more exciting, because I think it's given us really an opportunity to go back to what matters most. Sustainability, which has been around in some form for at least 2 decades, three, depending on how you count. Um, it was never about complying with policy or trying to follow the guide of policymakers and regulators. Now, policy for sure has an important role to play in kind of setting the right guardrails for society and so on. But the sustainability in business has always been led by business. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, I've, really enjoyed being in this, both when I was a practitioner in a corporation and having the opportunity to do what I do at EY every day, is that I think business is ultimately where not only sustainability is most needed, but it's where it's most possible. And I think business as a force for change, as a nimble, agile force for change, much more, for example, than I would say government. And so, for a while there was, a lot of responding or responding to, you know, policy and regulation in a way that, frankly, fostered more of a compliance mindset. And when you're in a compliance mindset, you're mostly focused on, okay, how do I comply with this at the least possible cost? Because that's the smart thing to do. Um, but when you're not forced really into compliance, then you're like, okay, like why does this matter? Where does this show up in our business, in our evolution? How does this connect to our purpose or our values? How does this connect to what our customers and clients want most from us? And where does this allow us to better compete in the market? So that's frankly where we've been now for the last couple of years, is this renewal, if you will, of this kind of um, really arguing and refining this business case, this ROI case for sustainability that really doesn't have anything to do with what does the government want us to do, but rather is like what is right for our own story with our own purpose, our own journey, and so it's been frankly exhilarating to reconnect to the why, because again, policy and government never really led this in many ways in the last few years. They've been trying to play catch up to kind of the vanguard of the business community and trying to bring up the rear. For sure, there's always a role for that, for policy and regulation to kind of more bring up the rear, but not lead from the front.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought about it that way, where in the past, where they have a lot of regulations, a lot of pressure to do it, it becomes very much of a compliance tactic to get through it. When those are taken off, and all of a sudden there's a lot of government forces out there that just don't really care what you do, it becomes culture, becomes cultural, and when one would argue even stronger reason for why you should be doing this.
Yeah, no,
Compliance and
exactly.
culture. Interesting. So, have you seen a lot of AI coming into telling the stories, like, for instance, with ESG reports and stakeholder communications and that sort of thing? Are more and more companies relying on AI to produce those, which are very complex, complicated communications? And is that good or bad, taking some of the human out of it?
I would say for the most part so far, that is not what we've seen. Um, I think the level of adoption for AI is more kind of deep into the guts, if you will. It has, tremendous capacity to help collect, organize, aggregate, and ultimately analyze complex data sets. Sustainability is there's very little that doesn't fit in the sustainability context. So whether it's all your people related data, your supplier related data, your operations related data, your procurement related data, your product, and so on and so on. So it's a complex, taxing, labor intensive work of love to collect and to some extent standardize and consolidate and aggregate all this information so that you can arrive at relatively comparable data both within an organization and of course across organizations. So that's the kind when you really look at those processes and what it takes to do that well, tools like AI will help make that just simplified and streamlined, just like we've seen big you know ERP type systems like HR management systems, financial accounting systems, ticket management systems, CRM systems over the last couple of decades. Really bring in a whole new way to simplify, to better organize, and ultimately create a lot more analytics, useful analytics for the business. And so I think AI is doing that for sustainability already. Uh, but to your earlier point, at the end of the day, when an organization chooses to tell its sustainability story, it has to come from, let's call it the organizational heart. What is their center? What is their purpose? What is their mission? What are their values? How did they choose to tell their story? How do they curate the story? Often, sustainability report is doesn't get the credit that a museum exhibit maybe gets in how well curated it was. And I think it's going to be a while before AI systems know how to do that as well. And I would tell you, having gone through that process many times myself, and you know, there is power in that process. All of the conversations you get to have with colleagues in different parts of an organization to get them to tell how what this data means to them, what these results, what these successes, what these trials and tribulations. And sure, the data is interesting, but when you kind of get to tell that story of here's what we tried, here's what worked, here's how we got there, here's who was involved. A lot of what would fall to the cutting floor by the time you put your report together. But to your point about culture, these are truly kind of culture building processes that reinforce the fabric of how organizations want to exist in the world, how people
Hmm.
like to think of their jobs, and the value they add, not just because of the widget they produced or the report they produced or the data they can generate, but also because of all the ways they were able to achieve that.
Oh. Yeah, one of the best reports I've ever seen was one of the very first pioneering reports, and that would have been Patagonia's Footprint Chronicles, because they chronicled everything they did, right and wrong, in their journey to sustainability, to teach everybody else what to do and what not to do and what to avoid and so forth. So, all right, Bruno, we're coming to the end here. You're a very thoughtful guy. I've known that forever, as long as I've known you. So, how about a lightning round, real quick? You ready
Sure,
for the lightning round?
let's
All
go.
right. Number one, biggest AI myth in sustainability right now.
I think it's the footprint. I mean, it's not a myth because it's real, but I think it clouds the real discussion. And so when people say, "Oh, AI good or bad because of its environmental footprint," I think that will get resolved, and there's already plenty of things underway to deal with that.
All right. So, a lot of anti stories going on out there about the data center footprints, AI footprints, and the only thing that beats an anti story is a better story, right? All right. Number two, the sustainability metric that matters most and nobody talks about.
Oof. Okay. One that has always spoken to me a lot, and that you don't get to see a whole lot of airtime because it doesn't necessarily get consumed externally as much, but it's the employee engagement part of
Hmm.
sustainability. It kind of goes back to my earlier point, but it's how well you connect your organization and its people to your sustainability program and storyline.
Boy, I saw that real time with a very large pharmacy company in America, and was sitting in at one of their meetings one day, and they were going down talking through their sustainability work they were doing, and they had a whole hit list of, what were their top priorities of audiences to talk to. And right before this particular section of the meeting, they were bemoaning the fact that their people didn't know about a lot of the cool stuff they were doing. And yet, when they went through their audiences, they put their own people down at number 6 out of 8 potential audiences. And I raised my hand and said, you might want to think about moving them to the top. Get them knowing what you're doing because they become one of your most vocal advocates. So I see that. All right, next one. Best episode of Sustainability Matters for the first time listener. What would you recommend?
Ooh, there's one we did that I liked a lot, I think, and I got a lot of feedback from actually first time listeners, which was, I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like about how to make sustainability everyone's job. And it was with a couple of guests who had both worked. One was still working there, the other one working there or had worked there for a very large Scandinavian build it yourself furniture company, and that really had kind of created a really interesting approach to say, a few people in an organization will have sustainability in their title, maybe a few more will have sustainability in their job description, but everybody needs to feel part of how to make an organization sustainable. And, many of our listeners for the Sustainability Matters podcast aren't necessarily sustainability professionals. So I really like that episode for how well it, I think, described the role that anyone can play in any organization to be part of their sustainability story.
Awesome. All right. Two more real quick. One book every business leader should read on this topic.
One of my favorite books that I still assign to my students, I think was back from 2014 by my friend Andrew Winston called The Big Pivot. And it's a great, great book. He's written more since that are also worth reading, and there's plenty of good books out there. But The Big Pivot, I think, really helps through the lens of corporate sustainability understand the what, the why, and the how. And it's a very easy read, but it's very powerful.
All right. We'll have a link to that in our show notes as well as to your episode. Finally, Bruno, finish this sentence for me, would you? The future of sustainability is
Exciting.
beautiful. I can tell. I can tell by the work you're doing. Your show's fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on today because I know how busy
And
you
you did
are.
not ask me about Harry Potter, so you teased
Well,
it.
I thought you were going to weave that in, and then I thought, well, maybe, all right, yeah, you got to bring the Harry Potter anecdote here.
Okay, so I mean the idea, and I had shared with Park recently. I'm a big fan. I read the books multiple times, both as a reader, as a dad, and one thing clicked for me early on when we were really trying to understand AI and what it was, and all of a sudden, for me, the realization it's like we all have magic now, just like the wizard community in Harry Potter, the whole wizard community, they all have magic. They all like they're born or they're with magic, and still they have to learn, how to harness it, how to craft their own their own spells, how to practice, and ultimately it's what you do with your magic that defines ultimately your both your power and ultimately your purpose and your place in your community. And for me, AI is the same. We now all have this superpower. We all have this thing that we didn't have before. We all have access to it, and we all have an opportunity to make use of it. And I think we're going to see exciting things done with it. I think we're going to see frightening things done with it. And but ultimately, I want to believe that that the punchline of that story will be a good one.
I hope so. I've said for 20 years, but it wasn't about AI, it was about storytelling. And when you really learn story structures like the ABT and the five primal elements and the story cycle system or whatever, and put them to use in sustainability or anywhere that you are trying to increase your influence and persuasion and ultimately the respect you get back from audiences because you're so clear on it, that story in its own right is a magic. But you have to understand the magic if you're going to cast a spell. You have to know how to use these structures in the right place and the right time to be able to win over your audience from their point of view. And now, to your point with Harry Potter and AI, it's just an amplification device. But don't approach it as artificial intelligence. Approach it like you said. It's either going to augment your intelligence or it's actual artful intelligence, but it's only artful and augmenting if you bring your own lived experiences, life and death experiences to it. But to me, that's where the magic is really going to explode and have an impact. And I think you're right. There's going to be good, there's going to be bad, but I'm hoping that the bright archetype of AI will overshadow the underbelly shadow archetype of it in story parlance. So, well, Bruno, thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure. Can't wait to see you and Jody again and get caught up and hear what's next in your storytelling future.
Sounds great. Thanks again for having me, and congrats again on such a successful both podcast, but also all the work you do beyond the podcast to to bring stories to life and help so many organizations figure out how to tell their stories.
Well, thank you. Now you're making me blush. Have a great one.
Bye, Park.
Hey, thanks so much for joining me on this edition of The Business of Story. And if you're an ad agency executive, then you are going to want to be here next Monday when Marcus Sheridan joins us to talk about your agency world and AI.
This is why you have to reinvent your identity as an agency. Because if you think SEO, paid ad services, and social media campaigns is going to hold you for the next 5 years, you're living in a dream state.
Yeah, they're tough words, but they're coming from an awfully smart guy. So you're going to want to hear what Marcus has to say about AI and your agency. And until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is a story you tell yourself. So make that one epic. Thanks so much for listening.